Hello and welcome to another segment of Open House here at Community Media. I am Raymond Gowker. I'll be your host. And this show is where we bring people from the community who are making our community a better place to live. And we've been working with the New Oxford Historic Society to celebrate the 250th anniversary of our country. But, what was it like here in New Oxford? What is our culture and why does that matter? And I find it very interesting, the things that we talk about how there was just Indian paths going through our community. But hey, it's not about me. Today we have with us the chair of the history department at Gettysburg College, Tim Shannon. Tim, thanks for coming in and sharing your knowledge with us. You have a couple books that you've written. One is Indian Captive. Can you tell us about that book?
Sure, Ray. A small correction. I've been the chair of the history department at Gettysburg College, but I'm not the current chair. And so I wouldn't want anyone back on campus thinking I'm usurping the throne or anything like that. But the book you reference is called Indian Captive, Indian King. And it is a biography of a fellow I like to call the most famous colonial Pennsylvanian you've never heard of, a fellow named Peter Williamson, who was a Scotsman. He claimed that he had been kidnapped from his home in Aberdeen, Scotland, and sold into servitude. He called it slavery, but sold as an indentured servant in Philadelphia, and that he labored in Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia until eventually gaining his freedom, getting married, settling in the Lehigh Valley, and then being taken captive by Delaware Indians at the outset of the 7 Years' War, what we often call the French and Indian War. Endured a horrible Indian captivity of several months, and then finally made his escape, joined the British Army that was then fighting the French, and ended up serving at Fort Oswego on Lake Ontario when it fell to the French in 1756. And then he, as a prisoner of war, was repatriated to Britain and had to find his way back to his native land of Aberdeen. And to do so, he began dressing up as a Native American, telling his story in taverns and coffee houses. And he published a captivity narrative called French and Indian Cruelty, in which he told his story. And when he finally got back to Aberdeen, the city fathers arrested him, called him a charlatan, and in particularly indicted him for kind of maligning the city merchants, the most prominent members of the community, because he blamed them for his kidnapping as a youth. And what that led to was a celebrated a trial in which he basically proved his story. Ultimately won this lawsuit and received a handsome settlement for it, and basically said, no, in fact, my story sounds like a tall tale, but this is the case. The interesting wrinkle, and the reason why I call him the most famous colonial Pennsylvanian you've never heard of, is that in investigating his story of kidnapping, there are a lot of testimonials and so forth brought forward into court. And I became very suspicious in reading all these legal records. I don't think he was ever an Indian captive. That he was in fact a soldier, that he was a servant. I was able to find evidence of those things in the various archives in Pennsylvania and back in Scotland. But in fact, he fabricated his Indian captivity. But the story he told was very popular, and it went through multiple editions. It was published in England, it was published in Scotland, it was published in Ireland. It eventually found its way into an abbreviated form into an anthology of captivity narratives that was published in Pennsylvania, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in I think the early 19th century. So it's a really fascinating story that tells you about life in Pennsylvania in the 1740s, 1750s.
So there's a lot of good information in his stories.
Yeah, even though one of the things that's interesting about his story, even though elements of it are fabricated. And he was a teller of tall tales, right? Everything he writes in his narrative, I think we should take with a grain of salt. But his experiences, for example, as an indentured servant, his experiences as a migrant who came over on a ship under sail in the in the 1740s ring true. His experiences as a soldier, as a former indentured servant who's recruited into the King's Arms during the 7 Years' War, match pretty much the profile of what we know about soldiers who served in that conflict. And then his experience as a prisoner of war is corroborated by other accounts of other soldiers who were taken at Fort Oswego, which was a horrible defeat for the British. And other narratives came out of that. And he, in fact, he tells some of the same stories, that are told in these other captivity narratives. And so and so that's what convinces me that he was, in fact, a prisoner of war, and he did return to Britain in the way he described.
So he got to Britain because he was a prisoner of war?
Yes. Yeah, so Fort Oswego it was a fort on the southeastern shore of Lake Ontario. It was kind of the terminal point of the British fur trade that went from New York City to Albany, all the way out to the Great Lakes. And at the start of the French and Indian War, the British kind of built it up. We're in the process of refortifying it. They wanted to build a navy there that could, they could launch on Lake Erie to challenge the French. But the French were well aware that this was going on. And so in 1756, they launched this campaign against it. And it was about 1,100 soldiers. Most of them were soldiers like Williamson, who were redcoats. They were recruited into the British Army, but they were colonists. They were raw recruits. And there were some soldiers from New Jersey there as well. And they were no match, for these French troops. And when the French showed up, they surrendered very quickly. They were gathered into the stockade as prisoners. And of course, the French showed up with Native American allies who weren't used to these rules about negotiated surrenders and prisoners of war. And so the Indian allies of the French were attacking them, and some lost their lives, and there was a bit of violence involved. But ultimately, these prisoners were transported to Quebec. They had a rather arduous journey, via the St. Lawrence River. To Quebec. And all this anticipated a much more famous story that comes out of that era, which is the story of the siege of Fort William Henry, which happened the following year in upstate New York. And that's the story that inspired Last of the Mohicans. And if you've read the novel, you've read the book, you know that the French allied Indians attack the garrison after it's surrendered, and and there are scalpings and murders, and many of these soldiers are taken captive. And that became the famous story, of the 7 Years' War, because James Fenimore Cooper wrote about it in Last of the Mohicans. But what happened at Oswego a year earlier, very, very similar circumstances. Mm-hmm. And those prisoners of war, including Williamson, when they returned to Britain, they were really the first eyewitness accounts of Native American warfare to come back into Britain. And so when he published his narrative, there was a reading public that was anxious to hear about this. Braddock's defeat, which had occurred on the banks of the Monongahela River in 1755, news of that had already broken in Britain, how the French and their Indian allies had destroyed this British army. But there weren't really prisoners, from that engagement. And so there wasn't this influx of kind of people who had directly experienced Braddock's defeat returning to Britain in the way that Williamson and his fellow prisoners of war were repatriated and could tell these very visceral accounts of warfare in colonial Pennsylvania.
So he found himself around the place that he was born. He's trying to get back, and he's finding a great way to come up with money.
Yes, yeah. I mean, so when they land back in Britain, they land in Plymouth, which is on the southern shore of England. And in some ways, he's even though he calls his captivity narrative French and Indian cruelty, in some ways he's very fortunate, because many of his fellow prisoners of war ended up going to France and having to endure stays in basically prisoner of war camps in northern France before they could return. Remember, these are colonial Americans. All they want to do is go home, right? But Williamson, the ship he's on actually docks in Plymouth. There are about 300, 350 of these prisoners of war on it. And basically the Army says to those who can no longer serve, we're cashiering you out of the Army. And he had received a wound in his hand. And so he's basically given his walking papers, but he's got to get back to northern Britain. He's got to get back to Aberdeen, right? And so what he comes upon as his way to do that is to publish this narrative and basically peddle it as he moves around, and he figures out that if he dresses up in Indian costume, that audiences want to hear about Native Americans, and so that's the clever way he does it.
Very clever.
Yes, very, very clever.
And you won a prize for that book.
Yes, from a Center for Scottish Studies at the University of Guelph in Ontario, in Canada. Yeah, which was kind of interesting. I thank heavens for the Scots. They appreciated the story. And in fact, a lot of the research I did for this was in Edinburgh at the Scottish National Archives, and I was reading these court documents, some of which looked like mine were the first eyes to look at them in many, many, many years. But his story was reasonably well known in Scotland. I met some Scottish historians who oh, you're working on him. Yeah, we know about him. We learn about him when we're in grade school.
Okay.
Because he became famous, not only as an Indian captive, but also as a victim of what they called the kidnapping trade. The idea that children were snatched off the streets and sold into indentured servitude. And Scotland in the 1740s, it was not a prosperous place. They were still periodic famines and stuff. And his story is such that it would appear that he came from a family that lived in the rural hinterlands of Aberdeen. Family fell on hard times, and he ended up in Aberdeen, and he claimed it was because his father sent him there to be educated. But my suspicion is he was basically what we call a homeless child, right? Somebody who didn't really have a means of support, and so somebody came along and offered him a warm place to sleep, some food. All he had to do was sign an indenture, to agree to go labor in Pennsylvania. And if you read the newspapers of this era in Scotland, they are filled with advertisements, ships that are sailing, and they want to recruit servants. And they describe Pennsylvania as this wonderful place, plenty to eat, plenty of employment. And after a few years of labor, you're welcome to come home, And of course, a lot of servants were recruited in this way. He was young. And so his kidnapping case, as he described it, came to center on the question of, well, actually, how old was he when he signed this indenture? If you were 14 years or older, you could sign an indenture in the way that we would say if you're 18 today, right? You're an adult. That, in those days, it was 14. If you were younger than 14, somebody had to sign for you, a parent, a guardian, or something like that. And he was only 13. And so ultimately the case came down to that matter of age. And so he was kidnapped.
He was kidnapped.
Yeah, is what the court determined. And in reading the records, you can see that it's much fuzzier. The idea that somebody threw a bag over his head and binded him and threw him on board a ship, not so much. He was more cajoled into doing this, probably out of material want.
And you decided to look into this because something just didn't seem right.
Yeah, it's a real interesting story, and it's a good example of how historians, I think, you start, investigating one question, looking for one thing, and then your curiosity gets piqued by something else. And so, where I first encountered him, I was actually working in a different research library, and I was looking at 18th century images of Indians because I was very interested in material culture, the artifacts, that they were displayed holding. And one of the things that fascinated me was a device called a pipe tomahawk. It was a trade tomahawk that had a pipe bowl attached to it. So if you had a handle for that had been hollowed out, it could serve as a pipe as well as a weapon or a striking device. And I see this image of a Delaware Indian. It's called a Delaware Indian. It's smoking a pipe tomahawk. It's one of the earliest images of a pipe tomahawk that I'd ever seen. But I'd never seen this image before. I thought I'd seen pretty much every printed image of a Native American from that era. It was from a book published in Ireland, in the 1760s. And in investigating that image, I found out who Williamson was. And I certainly was not the first historian to read his narrative, right, and be interested in his narrative. But previous historians who've read his narrative, had basically said, yeah, we're not sure if this is a true story. It kind of raises our eyebrows. But nobody had ever really tried to do the hard work of investigating his story, kind of unraveling the fact from the fiction. And that's what I spent many years doing, like I said, both in the archives in Scotland and then here in various, the state archives in Harrisburg, the Pennsylvania Historical Society in Philadelphia, even City Hall in Philadelphia is where I found the will of the man who he said was his master when he was an indentured servant, which was fascinating. I didn't think I'd be that lucky to actually find his master, but I was able to do that. So a lot of digging, a lot of detective work in that regard.
Which is amazing in itself, that you would take the time and effort to track down the truth.
Well, yeah, that's what we try to do, right, as historians. Sometimes it's a lot harder to find than at other times, right?
But what a passion, I mean.
Yeah, well, it's my wife and children, make fun of me whenever I use the line "historian as detective," and I think I've found something out. And but it is a lot like detective work. It's more exciting when you see it on television and it's police officers who are doing it. But the idea that there are clues scattered about in different locations and you've got to go hunt them down, and you've got to make some judgments about what is factual and what isn't. So I've enjoyed it very much.
Dr. Shannon, what is it like to be one of the first people to come up with this enlightenment on anything that you research? I mean, you're spending years looking for clues, and all of a sudden, this one, each clue you get, you must have some type of excitement, some type of rush.
Sure, I think you do have those moments in the archives when you're looking at something and it's a jigsaw puzzle piece that you're ready to put in the puzzle. I've always liked working with old materials. I do primarily 18th century American and British history. Of course, I have colleagues who do the ancient world, and do, Chinese history and so forth. And I'm really in awe of them. Somebody who can read a medieval manuscript in Latin or Greek, that's very impressive to me. But, but going into an archive and looking at documents, especially handwritten documents, going back to the 18th century, you're holding a literal piece of history there. And so you do get a rush out of that. But oftentimes you're in a haystack. You're looking for that needle. I spent a lot of time one day looking at microfilm of it was tax lists, in the state archives in Harrisburg, just on reels of microfilm. And that gets very old after a while. But again, I was looking for evidence of Williamson, from when he would have been post-indenture, when he would have been a free man and therefore would have been taxed. And I found him, and again, that's a eureka moment. It's confirming that element of his story. So yes, it feels great, and then you get the hard work of actually having to sit down and write a coherent narrative about it, and that takes a lot of time too.
So I'm just curious, he was married?
Yes, although he claimed that after he gained his freedom, that he married the daughter of a wealthy planter, basically a prosperous Pennsylvania planter, and that it was his father-in-law who set the family up on a homestead in the Lehigh Valley, which was definitely frontier territory at that time. But I could find no evidence of that marriage, and again, marriage records in the 1750s are pretty hit and miss, right? But I could find no evidence of property either, that he owned. He never actually named his father-in-law or his wife in the narrative. And then he claimed that after his Indian captivity, when he returned, his wife had died, right?
Okay.
And so that's why he joined the army. So, so my conclusion was that he was, in fact, never married while he was in North America. When he returned to Britain, he actually married 3 different times, not all at once. Right. Although I wouldn't have put it past him, in his story. But he did have 3 different marriages. He outlived the first 2 wives, and he after his winning his lawsuits in Aberdeen, he settled in Edinburgh, which was the capital city of Scotland, and he opened up a coffee house in a book selling business. And his wife and her father were in the book-selling trade in Edinburgh, and so he kind of got into that business in that city by virtue of that marriage.
And then you have some other books that you wrote?
Yes, I've written several others. My first book was about the Albany Congress of 1754, which, if you've studied your American history, is most famous because Benjamin Franklin was there. Representing the colony of Pennsylvania. It was an intercolonial Congress, and Benjamin Franklin proposed a plan of colonial union to kind of better marshal and organize the resources of the colonies, the British colonies, as they were facing renewed warfare with France. And that plan of union was not adopted by any of the colonial governments or by the British Parliament, to which they also sent it. But it's often been considered kind of an early blueprint for American Federation, a precursor to the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution. But it was also a treaty. It was a treaty between the colonies and the Iroquois Confederacy. And so there was an element there of Anglo-Indian relations that was worth investigating. And Franklin, of course, was very interested in Native Americans and in the Iroquois nations in particular. And so my first book was about that treaty and intercolonial Congress. And then I also, a few years after that, published a book about Iroquois diplomacy on the early American frontier, talking about the Iroquois Confederacy and its prominence, in early American diplomacy across that divide between native and colonial peoples.
And French and Indian cruelty.
That's the title of, that's the title of Williamson's captivity narrative. And I did, a few years ago, I did publish a modern edition of that narrative because I thought, it should be available to people if they were interested. There are some very famous captivity narratives from the colonial era. Mary Rawlinson from New England, she was a captive in Massachusetts during King Philip's War in the 1670s. Mary Jameson, who was taken captive just west of Gettysburg, the area of Chambersburg. Her captivity narrative from the 7 Years' War is also one that exists in modern editions. I have my students read it because it's, the location's very close to Gettysburg. But Williamson's narrative was never published in its entirety in North America. And even though it remained in print in Scotland well into the 19th century, there wasn't a modern edition of it. And so I, with the University of Edinburgh Press, I published a modern edition of that a few years ago. And the whole idea there is to be able to let readers see the narrative themselves, but also give kind of the introduction and the supplemental material that will help them make sense of it.
Mm-hmm. So, you have a deep passion for early American, Native American, and British history around that era.
Yes, I do.
So how did it happen?
I grew up in New England. I grew up in Connecticut, and from a very early age, I was interested in history. Particularly, I remember, as a grade school student reading biographies of the Founding Fathers. There was a series of them in my school library, and I think I pretty much read all of those, right? And then as I would walk, into the center of town, to go to Little League games or school or whatever, there was an old churchyard that had these gravestones that went back to the 18th century. And if you know the New England, landscape, The Puritans weren't famous for their art, but one thing they cared about was gravestones, because gravestones were billboards. As people walked by, they were reminders of our mortality, that death could come at any time, and we should all be prepared for it, right? And so these gravestones in this cemetery, some of which were quite decrepit and whatnot, they're just these beautiful images on them, and so I was really captivated by those. And my interest in early American history pretty much came from growing up in an old New England town, and only as I got older, of course, that I realized, oh well, that's that kind of architecture, and who exactly were these people who settled this town, and what is Puritanism and that sort of thing. But there was that connection, and then in college, I was fortunate to take courses with a very famous early American historian who luckily is still with us, Gordon Wood. He's retired now, but he's published widely on the Revolutionary era. And so in his courses, I found those very inspirational. And that's what convinced me that, doing history, as a profession, becoming a professor was a career path that I would want to pursue.
And that's because you're a college professor.
Yeah. It's certainly, I had other teachers too, high school teachers who were great. I always liked my history teachers, whether they were in grade school or high school or college. I always found them interesting. Every now and then I'll have a student who says, oh, this is so much better than high school history. They just made us memorize dates. And I say, well, fortunately, I never had anybody like that. It was always about trying to understand the past through the eyes of somebody who lived in that time. You can look up the dates in those days in an encyclopedia. Now, of course, you can look them up on Wikipedia, right? But really, history is about understanding and interpreting the past, trying to look at the world through the eyes of somebody who lived 200, 300, 1,000 years ago, and understand that the way they saw the world made sense to them. I always try to disabuse my students of the notion that we're so much smarter than people back then, right? This is a good example of this is the Salem witch trials. When I teach the Salem witch trials, how stupid did these people have to be to believe in witchcraft and to convict people, to take their lives for this evidence, And well, if you gave those people IQ tests, they were probably just as smart as we are today, right, in terms of their raw intelligence. It's just that the way they looked at the world was very different from the way we look at the world. And within their logic, the way things happened made sense to them, in a way that it no longer makes sense to us. But it doesn't mean they were stupid. It's just they lived in a different world. There's that famous line, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, and I believe that.
They had a different lens, a different understanding, a
Certainly.
different conception of how things worked.
Yes.
And it was shared.
Right, exactly. Why else could you get all these people to agree, that witch trials were necessary, that they were under threat from these invisible forces? Exactly. If it was just one person who had these crazy delusions, well, they would recognize that person for who they were, somebody who's delusional. But the fact that they shared this frame of reference, this common frame of reference, it made sense to them.
So, Dr. Shannon, your peers, your parents, your family noticed this passion in you.
I hope so.
Probably at an early age, too.
Yeah. Well, my parents, God bless them, placed a great deal of emphasis on education. I'm one of 6 kids, and from a very early age, they emphasized that your job as a child is to get a good education, right? And they made that possible for us. Truth be told, I think Mom and Dad, at the time I was deciding to go off and get a history PhD, would have much preferred I went to law school. Certainly, once they saw, that I was thriving there and that I was having success in this career path, they were very, very happy for that. And my wife and kids have certainly indulged me, and have let me do this. It's a truism of life, right? That you find something you like to do and do it, and you'll live a happy life, right? Mm-hmm. Nothing worse than being stuck in a job as an adult that you do not like,
Mm-hmm.
And so I was fortunate, with the family life and background I had, to have people who supported me in that way.
But you spent a lot of time and a lot of skill in solving mysteries. And that is a commitment.
It is a commitment, but it's part of the job, and that's one of the big differences between, say, teaching history at the high school level and teaching it at the college level. I mean, the teaching part is very similar, right? You have this historical knowledge, you want to impart it to students, and certainly there are high school students who do. I'm sorry, high school teachers, who do wonderful work that I could not do. But when you're doing it at my level, at the college level, another component of the job is going to the archives and producing history, right? Writing articles, writing books that add to what we know about the past, and that is, and that's what inspires me to do it.
Yeah, and that's the part that you like.
Yeah.
But also, I have my phone here. I don't
Sure.
mean to be disrespectful. Usually I have everything I want to talk about,
Okay.
somewhat on paper. But, I was sitting down yesterday and I'm thinking about this interview. I've been thinking about it all week, but yesterday gave me time. And I looked up some of the reviews that some of your students had. And I have to share some of these. So this was on the website where you review your professors. Definitely a difficult professor, but so worth it, and the "so" is in capital letters. He's my favorite teacher I've had in my life. He was my favorite teacher I've had in my life. It'd be a shame to be a history major and not take a class with him before graduation. Dr. Shannon is honestly one of the best professors in the history department. His lectures are super clean and focused. The readings are relevant and nearly as concise as they could be. And the workload wasn't too overwhelming for a history course. Shannon is personal, unpragmatic, and low stress. Now, there was a couple other ones I read where they talked about the essays they have to write. But hey, it's if you don't assimilate the information.
Sure. Well, we put a lot of emphasis on student writing and research at Gettysburg. It's a small liberal arts college. They're not in a big lecture hall with 350 other students, and so they get a lot of individual attention. And so we do expect them to be doing the work of historians themselves. Whenever possible, reading primary source materials, and writing their own interpretations, because that's how you do it.
And what a great opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, you're lucky to go to Gettysburg and have that experience, really. If you get a chance to take a class with Professor Shannon, go for it. The course topics were so diverse and interesting, and it was fun and laid-back class. He's always willing to listen, is a fair grader. Likes to assign research papers.
There you go.
There you go. Excuse me. Love Professor Shannon. Explanation marks. 2 of them. I've taken 4 classes with him at every level, 100 to 400 levels, and he's also my advisor. He's funny, knows his stuff, and is the best if you're interested in material culture or early American history. Expect quizzes on almost every book. Tough grader at all levels, but if you work hard and like history, you'll be fine. That's a testimony of honor for you, sir.
Thank you very much. You're embarrassing me, but
Good.
Always take those reviews with a grain of salt too. But it feels good at the end of the semester. Here we are, in May, and so the semester's just ended, and it always ends with a big rush and a lot of grading and all that. But it's fun work. It's why I've done it as long as I have.
And there's a good question. How long have you been at Gettysburg?
I've been at Gettysburg since the fall of 1996, so 30 years. I taught for 3 years before coming to Gettysburg in the New York State system at SUNY Cortland, north of us. and had finished my graduate study in 1993. So I've been almost all of my career has been at Gettysburg, and it's been wonderful. It's a great school. The students are wonderful. My colleagues are wonderful. And so, I couldn't ask for a better position.
Were you extremely excited when you were accepted to come to Gettysburg?
Well, yeah, and for several reasons, I considered it, to be the liberal arts environment I wanted to be in. But of course, Gettysburg is Gettysburg, right? And so if you're going to teach American history, and I don't even teach the Civil War, it's not a topic that holds special interest to me. But the fact is, we're at Gettysburg, and it's a central point in American history. And so it brings to our campus students oftentimes who are already kind of well immersed in American history, who've been reading history since they were little kids, whose parents have brought them, as tourists to Gettysburg. And so a lot of our students just show up ready to go. They're good readers. Sometimes they show up knowing a lot more about the Civil War than I know about the Civil War. Some of them are reenactors, and so I think that's great. And if you were to compare Gettysburg and the size of its student body to similar schools like, say, Dickinson or Franklin and Marshall, we've always had more history majors, and that reflects the fact that we're at Gettysburg, and I think we have a very good history department. So yeah, it's been great that way.
It's nice to have students that have passion.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. It certainly is, and that's a difference between. I don't want to knock the institution where I taught before coming to Gettysburg, which where I had good students there too. But oftentimes, they were in a course with me because they had a distribution requirement. They had to take a U.S. history course or something like that. And here at Gettysburg, you do get that passion, that sense of passion from the students.
It's a great opportunity. Okay, so let's look at this area.
Okay, sure.
Here we are, we're in the New Oxford area, and the Native Americans. Mm-hmm. Okay, so 1600s?
Sure, yeah.
Who's here and what's their motivation?
Sure. So, going back to the time of Pennsylvania's founding, which is 1681, 1682, the native peoples that you would find in this area would include the Susquehannocks, who lived along the lower Susquehanna Valley, today Lancaster County and into Maryland, right, as the Susquehanna flows into the Chesapeake Bay. The Shawnee Indians who came from further west, but moved quite extensively around this area. The Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people, modern upstate New York, particularly the Seneca people, who lived in the near modern-day Rochester, New York, the Genesee Valley. The Susquehanna River, was basically this highway. What Route 81 is to us today in our automobiles, the Susquehanna River was to native peoples in terms of traveling from the Great Lakes region, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, down to the Chesapeake Bay. And so a lot of Indians coming back and forth, engaging in warfare, engaging in diplomacy, engaging in trade. When the Europeans begin showing up in the early 17th century, long before there is a Pennsylvania on the map, there are Dutch fur traders, Swedish fur traders, French fur traders, eventually, English fur traders, Dutch fur traders, who are bringing these European manufactured goods like knives and woven cloth to these Native American customers who are going into the Delaware Valley, the Chesapeake Bay region to trade with them. And so, you can picture this as a landscape through which a lot of people are moving. They're moving on foot, they're moving via canoe, but once the European fur traders show up, they're traveling great distances to trade furs, bountiful furs in the interior of the continent, with these Europeans that are showing up in these sailing ships with these trade goods. So the Susquehannocks were in a very strategic position, occupying the lower Susquehanna Valley, and that ultimately leads to warfare with some other native peoples, like the Iroquois nations to their north, but also colonists in Maryland and Virginia. The Delaware Indians, today often referred to as the Lenni Lenape Indians, were also occupying this region. By the time we get to the era of William Penn and the founding of Pennsylvania, many of those Delaware have moved from the Delaware Valley into the Susquehanna Valley. The Susquehanna Valley, becomes this kind of refugee area, if you will, for native peoples who've been displaced by the colonization of the Chesapeake Bay. Jamestown and the English showing up there, the colonization of Maryland in the 1630s and 1640s. Native peoples who come into conflict with those colonists move north into the Susquehanna Valley because it's relatively open and secure, but still close enough that they can be engaged in the fur trade. So the Conoy Indians, the Piscataway Indians, the Nanticook Indians, these are groups that if you drive through the Susquehanna Valley today, you'll see these place names. And that's because those places are named after those groups as they moved into that area. By the time you get into the early 18th century, the most powerful group in this region would be the Conestoga Indians, who lived in modern-day Lancaster County. And they were named the Conestoga Indians because of Conestoga Creek, which is where they tended to congregate. In 1680s to 1720s, they're kind of an amalgamation of different groups that have settled in this area. Seneca Indians are a big part of it, but also kind of remnants of the Susquehannocks who had been dispersed by warfare in the late 17th century and have kind of resettled in the lower Susquehanna Valley. And so the Conestogas, so it's very interesting because the Conestogas were not there as a group in, say, 1600, but by 1700 they are. And they're a product of this kind of shifting of populations in this area. And they, again, kind of serve a role as traffic control, from the northern Susquehanna Valley into the southern Susquehanna Valley. And William Penn treats with them when he visits the colony in 1700, 1701. He goes out and signs a treaty with them and so forth. So they're kind of the most influential group. By the time we get to the era of, say, the 7 Years' War of Peter Williamson, who we were talking about earlier, the Delaware Indians have continued to migrate into the Susquehanna Valley. They're very significant. The Shawnee as well, and the Iroquois. So this is primo real estate that native peoples and colonists are going to be fighting over during the 1750s and 1760s.
So during the French Revolution War, there's more colonists in this area.
Yeah. Yes.
With these groups of Indians.
Yes. But
they're also fighting with us against the French and Indians.
It's a region of shifting alliances and interests, certainly. So we have the 7 Years' War, French and Indian Wars, we've been calling it, in the 1750s, early 1760s. Then we have the American Revolutionary War. And during the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, a lot of these native peoples are allied with the French. And the reason they're allied with the French is the French are at Fort Duquesne, modern-day Pittsburgh. The French have asserted a military presence in the Ohio Valley, the headwaters of the Ohio River. And the French are offering trade to these Indians. They're competing with English fur traders who have moved into that region as well. And that's why the French are fortifying it. They want to keep the British out of there. Okay. But the other great pressure here is land. And Pennsylvania has been growing by leaps and bounds in terms of its population. The major migrations are coming from the Rhine River Valley, a lot of German-speaking colonists coming in. and there are a lot of German place names around here. And then Scots-Irish, and these are the descendants of Scottish colonizers of what today we would call Northern Ireland, what they called in those days Ulster, and they are pouring in primarily because of economic dislocation in Ireland. And they are moving out west faster than the colonial government of Pennsylvania can keep track of them. And they are causing a lot of trouble because they are coming into conflict with Native peoples. They're settling on land that Native peoples say they have not sold, that they have not surrendered. And that is causing this tension that leads many of these Native peoples in central and modern Western Pennsylvania to ally with the French during the French and Indian War.
And this is actually happening through Lancaster also?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And
I mean, by the time you get to the 1750s, Lancaster is fairly secure, right? Although not entirely, but the further west you come, certainly by the time you get to this area, this is up for grabs, right? And this is very insecure. If you're colonial peoples living here, you're on your guard, and if you're Native peoples living here, you're well aware of this tide of settlers who are coming and threatening your homelands. So it's a very uneasy situation.
So the Native people, they're fighting to maintain their lifestyle
Yes.
and their land, but at the same time, when did they become aware that either they got to adapt,
Right.
and there is the ability to adapt? I mean,
Yeah, well, certainly some Native peoples by the 1750s have decided to vote with their feet, right? And so again, when we talk about the Delaware, right, the reason they're called the Delaware is they're originally in the Delaware River Valley, right? But then they migrated into the Susquehanna River Valley, and then some by the 1740s have picked up and have moved into the Ohio River Valley, right? So they're kind of spread out. There are others who have tried to live among growing colonial neighbors, and a good example of this is the Conestoga Indians, who by the 1750s are now a very small group. They're no longer as powerful as they were 50 years earlier. But they're living in Lancaster County surrounded by colonial farmers. And if you go into the Lehigh Valley, there are Native peoples living there in communities established by Moravian missionaries. These are German Protestant missionaries. Bethlehem and Nazareth are towns that are named by these Moravian missionaries and their Indian converts. And so they are trying to live in this world that's becoming increasingly European. And then there are Native peoples who are resisting, right? And they are fighting. But they, because of the fur trade, they have become dependent on this economic relationship. They do need gunpowder, in order to hunt because they've adopted firearms, right? And they've become reliant on textiles, woven textile cloth rather than animal pelts for their clothing and so forth. And so the fur trade has created this, this very tense relationship. Can't live with them, can't live without them, is what's going on there. So even those Native peoples who have moved west into the Ohio Valley, where there's not much of a colonial population, they're still up to their eyeballs in the fur trade, and so they can't entirely disavow connections to these European peoples. And so, you have squatters who are coming out, settling on their land. You have land speculators, wealthy people who are trying to lay claim to that land for their own profit, not intending to move there, but see value in that land. And then during the era of the French and Indian War, you have armies showing up, professional soldiers, French soldiers, British soldiers who are doing what armies do. They're building roads, Forbes Road, right, which basically follows the path of modern Interstate 76, and Braddock's Road, are both major feats of military construction that are going to open up this frontier to more settlers. And they're building forts. Fort Duquesne becomes Fort Pitt, becomes the city of Pittsburgh. And so it's a very rapidly changing world for these Native peoples. And the sad part of it is that those who make that effort to live among Europeans, like the Conestoga Indians, like the Moravian Christian converts, the story does not end well. In December of 1763, Conestoga Indian town is wiped out by the Paxton Boys, basically this frontier band of vigilantes who ride into town and kill everyone they find there. And when they realize that they haven't got all the Conestogas, those that have taken refuge in Lancaster, they ride into Lancaster a few days later and they kill all of them. The Moravian Indians encounter increasing difficulties as a result of the 7 Years' War and move west into the Muskingum River Valley in today eastern Ohio. And they are wiped out in a massacre that happens at the tail end of the American Revolution in 1782. And so relations have become so bad that Indians who decide that the best route is kind of a pacifist approach, we're going to adopt Christianity, we're going to try to live as peaceable neighbors, it's becoming increasingly untenable,
So the people who lived here in New Oxford, the native people, what were their values? What was their motivation? Let's take it before the Europeans came.
Sure. So native peoples in this area would have, first of all, we should dispel the notion that they were nomadic peoples who just wandered across the land, picking fruit off of trees and fish out of streams and so forth. They were agriculturalists, they would plant crops, corn was the big crop. They did commute seasonally, from fishing camps in the spring to hunting camps in the winter to village sites, where they would grow corn in the summer. They were what anthropologists would call kinship states, right? They had clans, as we would understand tribes today, where government is very informal. Nobody is making anybody do anything else in the sense of like paying taxes or enslaving people or raising armies. These are societies that are based on what we would call consensual politics, right? Everything is about mediation and discussion and arriving at a consensus and determining how you're going to act with your neighbors, and that's the native world that these Europeans are encountering. They make war with enemies, they trade with friends, and so there is a native diplomacy with outsiders that goes on. But warfare is not about conquest. It's not about killing all your enemies and conquering their land. Warfare tends more to be about young men proving their worth, making the transition from childhood into adulthood. And it's about acquiring captives, people who can be adopted into your community to replace those who have died, perhaps. One thing we haven't mentioned is the introduction of diseases. When Europeans show up, they bring with them these communicable diseases like influenza, most famously smallpox too. And that puts a tremendous population pressure on these native communities. And so how are you going to replace people you've lost to disease? Well, you're going to go out and make war and get captives who you can bring back and adopt into your communities. And so that's a very shorthand version of how they were living at the time these Europeans show up.
So the clans, their goal was, how do we live together for the betterment of the community? Yes.
And they do certainly recognize, other, the most basic social organization would have been the village, right? And within the village, families and clans, right? But then they would recognize, of course, like a tribal territory. There are other villages, other towns within our territory that are akin to us. They speak the same language. They live the same lifestyle as we do, and they have the same clans. And so if I'm traveling and I walk into this village and I'm a member of the Turtle Clan, I'll find food, I'll find shelter among other Turtle Clan members. When I'm doing that.
There's a sense of us.
Certainly, yes, exactly. Yeah, we are distinct people who have distinct territory, and that separates us from others, some of whom we may be at peace with, others of whom we may be at war with.
So in this area, New Oxford, East Berlin, where were their villages?
That's a good question. Archaeologically, we want somebody at the State Museum to tell us that, right? I can't really tell you that specifically because, I'm not an archaeologist. And the archaeologists will give you evidence of settlements, of town sites going all the way back to what they call the Paleo era, the first human beings, to come into this region, during the last ice age, right up to the point of European contact. But certainly the most famous native community would be the Conestoga Indian town that we've talked about. But there are, I know, for example, along the Susquehanna, lower Susquehanna in Lancaster County, the state archaeologists have excavated village sites on both sides of the Susquehanna River around modern-day Columbia, Pennsylvania. And a lot of the artifacts from those sites are in the State Museum, and they're wonderful. If you go to very old sites, it's primarily pottery, right? But as you get into the era of European contact, that's where you see the first contact with Europeans is revealed in these metal goods, that begin showing up in these archaeological sites, or European ceramics that survive in these sites. Yeah.
So longhouses.
Yes.
There's evidence of some of those in this area.
Longhouses are these kind of long, multi-family, bread loaf-shaped structures. That was a very common form of domestic architecture among these native peoples. The Haudenosaunee, the term used by the Iroquois to describe themselves, that means people of the longhouse, right? And so yes, archaeologists can look at what they call post holes, the evidence where these, the posts for building these structures, have left an archaeological record, and they can give you a sense of the size of that, and then, therefore the number of people who lived in that longhouse.
So there's an assumed tale that in this area there was a large war that occurred amongst Indian tribes. Have you ever?
I've heard some reference to that, although I have to confess I'm not especially familiar with that. And again, I'd want an archaeologist to tell me. I mean, there are various, stories that we hear. Evidence from human remains. I mean, obviously, if you come across human remains, sometimes they show evidence of violent death. If you go out into the Mississippi River Valley, the mound building civilizations that predated European contact, and we still see evidence of these mound builders, right? Some of those mounds have mass burials in them, and that's evidence of human sacrifice, right? And those are societies that were politically more sophisticated than the societies I've been describing for you here. These were societies that had, their anthropologists call them chiefdoms. So they have very clear social hierarchies, right? And there's evidence of people who had been enslaved to help build, those monuments, those mounds. We don't see that so much here.
So the Susquehanna was a major traffic area.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, like I said, think of it as the Route 81 of its day, right?
How long would it take to canoe from?
That's a good question. Yeah. In my answer, in all seriousness, it all depends, right? How quickly do you need to get there? Diplomatic delegations would often travel with not just men, but women and children. The Treaty of Lancaster in 1744, it's between the Iroquois nations and the colony of Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia. Something like 200 Native Americans show up for that treaty, and they are coming, from modern upstate New York, and it takes them several weeks to travel because along the way they're stopping in, they're seeing other Native groups, they're making diplomatic councils and visits. They've got women and children with them, right? A Native war party of young men on foot, traveling very light would obviously move much more quickly. And so a lot of that travel would be occurring, I think, on foot. And that's how when captives are taken, Mary Jameson's captivity narrative, for example, she travels on foot from, in essence, modern-day Chambersburg to Pittsburgh with her captors. And they're moving very quickly because they do not want to be caught, right? And so it all depends.
And this isn't as if they're exploring, and this isn't probably the first time they've been coming down the Sesame.
Right, yeah. I mean, there are...
They know where they're going to stop.
Yes,
They stop there
exactly,
before.
yes,
They have relations.
Yes,
they know
exactly.
what they're going to get
People
there.
they're going to visit, people with whom they're going to conduct some diplomacy. There are paths, routes. There's a very good book that was published, I think, 1961, Indian Paths of Pennsylvania. And if you're interested, in this, any good library, university library, maybe a larger public library might have it, and it's great. You can open it up and you can see these paths that Native peoples traveled, and then when Europeans showed up, they kind of adapted them to their uses.
And there are some locally.
Yeah.
Route 30.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes, that makes perfect sense. Yes.
And that book I saw on Facebook.
Okay.
Marketplace.
Yep.
Just recently. So if you want that book for $100, you can get it.
Yeah, I mean it's a standard reference work, for anybody who's studying Native peoples in this area.
What is something that people overlook when they think about our Native Americans?
Well, I think I think there are just a lot of stereotypes, that come into play. And one is, we've already mentioned this idea that before Europeans showed up, these Native peoples were just living this kind of Edenic, nomadic existence, right? That they didn't have towns and villages, that they didn't plant crops, that they lived off the nature's bounty. And that's simply not so. There's plenty of evidence of them engaging in agriculture. There's plenty of evidence of them building towns and communities, defensive palisades in times of war to protect their villages. I think there's also this kind of predilection to assume hostility, kind of always being hostile to European colonists, that the de facto condition was war, right? And that's not the case either. Something I've studied extensively is these diplomatic encounters. So I mentioned the Treaty of Lancaster, and there's a lot of negotiation that goes on, right? Why did these Native peoples allow these Europeans to get a foothold here? Well, trade. They valued trade. They valued the goods these people were bringing. They valued them as potential allies against their native enemies, and so forth. And so it's much more complicated than a simple black and white. Every European colonist hated every Native American who hated every European colonist. There are shades of encounter and interaction here. And in some cases, these like these forts that get built during the 7 Years' War, they house troops, and what are troops there? They're there to make war, but they also become trading centers, right? They become points of contact between Native peoples and European peoples.
Mm-hmm. And fur was very important.
Oh yeah, very important. Yeah.
And for some of the first Europeans that founded in this area, pretty much, I don't know if they were settling, but they were fur traders.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and certainly in the Delaware, Susquehanna River valleys, these Europeans, the first Europeans that are showing up are fishermen and fur traders, yeah. And then gradually you'll get colonists. But even in, what becomes Pennsylvania, talk about the Dutch and the Swedish and the Finnish fur traders who show up in the Delaware River Valley. Their first settlements are really just forts to help them defend themselves, not so much against the Indians, who don't feel particularly threatened by them, but from other Europeans who might, sail a ship up and aim a cannon at them, and try to claim that fort, that trade for their own, and only very gradually do permanent human populations develop there. Pennsylvania is a little different, right? When William Penn shows up for the first time in 1682, he's bringing colonists with him. This is a real estate venture, and he wants to sell land that the king has granted to him, and he's actively recruiting colonists, not just in England, but in Ireland and in the Rhine River Valley. That's why very quickly Pennsylvania just becomes this mosaic, of all these different European groups, who are coming in. A lot of them are coming for religious toleration because William Penn, as a Quaker, preaches religious toleration, but a lot of them are coming for economic opportunity. Like we mentioned, the Scots-Irish is just, the economy is very depressed, they're very poor. In Pennsylvania in the 18th century, it's called the best poor man's country. It's the best place for you to go if you want opportunity for prosperity, low taxes. Nobody's going to compel you to serve in the military because guess what? There's no militia because it's a Quaker colony, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody's going to force you to pay taxes to support a church that you don't attend, and there's lots of land. So it very quickly becomes the point of migration, for these European folks coming in.
That culture.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What elements of that culture can you still see here today?
Well, certainly, it's interesting because historians of early America, for a long time, like back when I, was in graduate school, the debate was, well, which colonial region prefigured our modern United States? Was it New England with those Puritans and their Puritan work ethic that became the American work ethic, and their New England town meetings, which became the kernels of American democracy? Or was it the Chesapeake, right, with the arrival of plantation-style economy, a personal desire to pursue wealth and grow wealth and enrich, the introduction of African slavery, right? And so, this debate went on between the people in New England and the people of Virginia, right? And then, suddenly the middle colonies pop up, right? What about us, right? And if you look at, for example, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, right? These are societies that were religiously tolerant, that were ethnically diverse, that were very much committed to economic development, but on a kind of individual level, right? The individual pursuit of prosperity, but not relying on slave labor, not relying on the brutal exploitation of another race, and up to a certain point, seem to have pretty good intercultural relations with native peoples, right? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of historians today will say, look to Pennsylvania, look to New York as kind of the model for our modern American society. Pluralistic, tolerant, and very kind of materialistic, oriented towards material, the pursuit of material prosperity, but with a healthy respect for the right of other people to pursue that as well.
Okay.
One of the fascinating things about colonial Pennsylvania is that people who in the old world should have been killing each other, had recently been killing each other, suddenly lived in peace side by side here, And why was that? Was it because there was more bountiful resources, something for everyone? Was it because of William Penn's foresight in preaching religious toleration? No single religious group could become so powerful that it could trample on the rights and privileges of others, right? Maybe it was a combination of all those things. But in colonial Pennsylvania, there were examples of members of a community getting together and building a house of worship that one group got to worship there on Sunday morning, another group got to worship there on Sunday afternoon, right? Mm-hmm. And again, in Europe, those people would have been killing each other, mm-hmm. right? And here they are, sharing their house of worship. So very interesting that way, how Pennsylvania pulls this off.
And that's something that we could be proud of.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So, time of war, this area was very quick mm-hmm. to gather a militia together or a group of people who were going to fight for mm-hmm. the French, against the French,
yep.
and also against the British. Was it different here than it was in other areas for these people to say, I'm going to fight for this?
It is different. The big difference is, up until 1755, there's no militia in Pennsylvania, right? The colony is dominated by Quakers, the colonial assembly. Quakers are pacifists. And so they are not appropriating money to build forts, to build defenses. They are not appropriating money to raise military forces to fight in imperial wars, But then, by the time war does come, and it does come in 1755, the Quakers are numerically a tiny fraction of the colony's population, and there are plenty of non-Quakers who see war coming. Benjamin Franklin is one of them, who says, we got to do something here, and so very quickly in the 1750s, the balance of power in the colony's assembly shifts out of Quaker hands and into non-Quaker hands. The Scots Irish on the frontier around here are vehemently anti-Quaker. Because they feel their lives, their property are at stake in this war. And they are very quick to take up arms and organize voluntary militias. The Paxton Boys, who we mentioned, are an example of this kind of, I would call it frontier vigilantism, basically, right? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you have people like Benjamin Franklin, who is not living on the frontier, but is encouraging the organization of, a volunteer militia. And so Pennsylvania during the 7 Years' War does develop its own militia and does recruit soldiers for the British Army. And Peter Williamson, who we started our conversation about, is an example of this, right? Mm-hmm. And so by the time the American Revolution rolls around, certainly there's now, at least for a generation, there's been this legacy of military organization, recruiting manpower, and so Pennsylvanians do take up arms against the British in the Revolutionary War. There are still Quakers, though, and they are still, even though they're a small minority of the population, they're still a very vocal one, and in some ways still socially very influential. There are wealthy Quaker merchants in Philadelphia who are the descendants of the Quaker founders, of the colony, and they are still committed to their pacifist principles. And when the American Revolution breaks out, they don't want to be called loyalists, but they want to be neutralists, right? They want to stand aside in this conflict. But people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine don't want to give them that room to maneuver. It's, you're with us or you're against us, right? And so some of these Quakers do become loyalists. Thomas Paine, after he famously writes Common Sense, calling for American Declaration of Independence, he also writes the crisis letters. These are the times that try men's souls. And he's writing that to kind of mobilize and keep mobilized the American cause during the very trying years of 1776, 1777. he hates Quakers. He's saying, these Quakers are dragging us down, and they've got to decide whose side they're on, right? And so in that sense, it does become, Pennsylvania still retains this kind of unique circumstance of having this kind of legacy of pacifism and anti-militarism, that continues through the Revolutionary era.
I could go on, but has it been 4 hours now? And I'm taking your time, and I feel as if I'm one of the luckiest guys in Gettysburg because, the amount of tuition I had to pay.
There you go. Yeah. You saved a lot of money on tuition today.
I'm ready to go in and give you a review. I'd hate to take one of your tests, though. I don't think I'll do well. But I have one more question, and then I'll just share my gratitude for your time. So you become a historian. Mm-hmm. You're going through all this process of learning what it is to be a historian. Did you have any moment where it was like, man, I'm glad I'm a historian. This moment, no one could ever experience like I'm experiencing it now. Well,
I'll say that when I was working on the Peter Williamson book, and I was living in Edinburgh for 2 months. I had a sabbatical leave from school. I was able to go live. And I was just living on my own. My family was here, so I was living a pretty monkish life. Get up in the morning, go to the archives, come home at night. And but there were a couple occasions there where I'm in the rare books room, of the Scottish National Library, looking, for stuff on Williamson, and I found something there that I don't think any previous historian had found, in reference to trying to suss out Williamson's story. And that was, one of these eureka moments. It's like, yeah, this is great. This is fantastic. Moments like that are basically few and far between. Mm-hmm. But most days I wake up very happy I'm a historian, because I like the job, mm-hmm. and I like the life it has provided me. My brother asked me once, would you rather be researching or would you rather be teaching? And my answer to him is, well, whenever I'm doing one, I'm missing doing the other. And so I think that's a good sign. I just finished up 2 semesters of teaching, and I'm looking forward to a summer now where I'm going to get back into doing my research. And by the time, that's done, I'll be anxious to get back into the classroom and see a new batch of students and get to know them and have that experience. So it worked. It's worked out very nicely that way. And so I'm very happy to have been a historian and to continue being one.
So what questions are you trying to answer now?
Well, actually, right now, I've kind of, with my current project, I've moved out of everything we've been talking about here, and I'm interested in the Carlisle Indian School. And so I've started to do research related to the Carlisle Indian School. I learn a little bit more about that, and that's taking me into late 19th, early 20th century America, which is a field I haven't studied, since I was in graduate school more than 30 years ago. But I think, of course, the Carlisle Indian School is a fascinating place, has a fascinating history of its own, and there's the local connection to, it's not in Adams County, but it's not far out of Adams County. And I have been up on the campus of the Army War College a few times, and so I've seen, the buildings that still stand from the Indian School. I think it's a fascinating story.
Yep, the frame was to bring them here.
Yes, from out west, yes.
And change your culture.
Yes.
Okay. So, before we leave.
Yes.
250th anniversary.
Yes.
You have a chance from your heart to say anything to the people watching regarding to the 250th.
Yep. All right.
What would you like to say?
Well, I would say read more history. Certainly the 250th anniversary is an occasion to read about the Revolution, and and I'll be the first one to say, reading biographies of the founders is a great way to get into the history of the American Revolution. There are wonderful biographies out there of people like Washington and Franklin and Jefferson. I would encourage you to read books that have some analytical depth to them. You know, Gordon Wood, who I mentioned earlier, is a great historian. Joseph Ellis is another one who's written many biographies of the founders that I think are worthwhile. But then, biography is how most of us get into history, but there's lots of other history out there too. And I would say that, a lot of people like reading military history, and there's nothing wrong with reading about the battles, and there are great stories there. But if you can, read some of the social and cultural history of the Revolution as well. Again, try to get inside the head of these people and what they were thinking about, and why they would make the decision that independence was something they wanted to pursue, or perhaps something they wanted to resist. Right? I think we tend to neglect the people who were on the losing side of all of this. So it might be interesting to read a book about loyalists. It might be interesting to read a book about the anti-federalists, because when I teach the American Revolution, we start with the period of the 7 Years' War, and we end with the ratification of the Constitution. And I always end by telling students, learn more about the anti-federalists. These were the people who opposed the Constitution. And you must think, again, how stupid could they be, right? The Constitution's great, right? Nobody's against the Constitution. But in fact, when you understand why they were opposed to the Constitution, you understand the problems that a lot of people have with our government today, right? Yeah, and so these were not stupid people, and so take the opportunity perhaps to investigate some of the people who ended up on the wrong side of history in that regard.
So is the Revolutionary War over?
Well, I think so, yes,
Okay.
yes.
Right.
I think it's over. I do think it's over. I think we still fight about what it means, obviously, right? And we still fight about what the founders meant, right? And I think that's probably a good thing, that people on both the left and the right of American politics still want to lay claim to George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams as their heroes. That's good, because that does help bind us together.
Dr. Shannon, thank you so much for coming in here to our studios and sharing your heart, your passion.
You're very welcome, Raymond.
Thanks for being a teacher.
Oh, you're welcome.
I can just imagine being in your class, how these students that are history majors, how they feel as if they made the right decision coming to Gettysburg and taking you for a class.
Great.
Thank you very much. Thanks for helping with the New Oxford Historic Society and Community Media's 250th anniversary productions.
You're very welcome, and thank you for doing all of this. I think it's great to get the people engaged in the 250th.
Thanks for watching this segment of Open House here at Community Media. I'm Raymond Galker. I was your host. Hopefully you enjoyed your culture. You got a chance to get some information of the area that you were born in, or that you came here and lived. And take the chance to look into your history, look into your background. And thanks for watching this. And until we have a chance to bring someone as awesome as Dr. Shannon into our studio, stay healthy, be kind, and remember, you are the best.